welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are kicking off 4 days in a row of talking about Avatar: The Last Airbender, the live-action show on Netflix. All 8 episodes have dropped, but we do want to have some modicum of sanity, so instead of recording on all 8 episodes, or doing something where we've spoiled everything already for ourselves, we're going to watch 2 episodes at a time and then record each day. So today we're recording on episodes 1 and 2. If you've watched ahead, awesome. And if you want to send us questions or feedback or thoughts that you want to have us discuss about episodes we haven't talked about yet, please send those in to Matthew@theethicalpanda.com and just make sure to label them episodes 3, episode 5, whatever it is, so we know not to be spoiled. We'll have more to say in a bit about other ways you can help be part of the conversation, but let's just jump right into it. And I'll start with you, Paul. Episodes 1 and 2, what'd you think?
Well, I turned the show off within 10 minutes.
Okay.
And then I gritted my teeth and came back to it. And then I turned it off again.
Oh, no.
And then I used the seek bar to basically be like, okay, yeah, they're going to do that. Okay. I skipped a chunk of the first episode.
Okay.
And then I picked it up where the original series starts and watched the rest of episode 1 and then all of episode 2. And I thought there were some things that they did really well. I think that they kind of completely missed the essence of the original show in a way that is somewhere between heartbreaking and infuriating. To say something good in all this, I think that Dallas Liu as Prince Zuko does a fantastic job. With I think the scripts are very bad. I think the dialogue is brutal. But I think a lot of the acting performances are actually very good. Also, Ken Leung as Commander Zhao, I think is fantastic. And, that's good because spoilers for, season 1 of the original series, like he's the main. Okay.
I'm going to stop you there. Yeah. So what we're actually going to do this is, I think a lot of people probably have already seen the animated show, and we're going to be comparing the two the whole way we go.
Yeah.
But what we're going to do is the first part of the conversation, we'll try and just talk about what happens in episode 1 and 2.
Okay.
And then in a later section, we'll talk about what we know, having seen all of Avatar, about what's happening in these episodes.
Well, then I'll just say that I think that Ken Leung brought a lot of nuance and like verve. I don't know exactly the best word, but just he brought a lot to a role that I think at this point in the series, both Zhao and Zuko are more interesting characters to me than they were in the original series. So I would say those are the 2 spots where I feel like it's really shined so far.
I think it makes sense. Makes sense. Riki, what about yourself?
It was interesting for me listening to Paul's reaction to the beginning because I had maybe not as strong a reaction, but a similar, we're doing it this way reaction to the opening. And so what we're talking about here is that it starts in the past. Like from the perspective of the main story 100 years ago with the comet. And the beginning of the Fire Nation's war on the other tribes, and we get Aang's like kind of full backstory in the first I think like 10 to 15 minutes, and that is completely different from how the animated show starts, and I question it. My reaction is not as strongly negative I think as Paul's, but I definitely wonder like how it's going to play out, and I often use the term manipulative in terms of writing of television and movies, and to me like I kind of felt manipulated, like emotionally manipulated by that opening, which is not it is not necessarily a negative thing, but again it's very different from the animated show and it sets a different tone, I think, is the main thing.
Yeah, I hear that. I'm kind of in a mixed place because I think I had a very similar reaction, Paul, to what you were talking about the first time, and kept thinking to myself, this is not the show that I was looking for. And then about 2.5 hours later, while doing some other work, I turned it on again and watched the first 2 episodes again. Kind of like I've talked about with something like Mad Max, the most recent one, or other things like that. When I was looking to compare it to the original, it fails and does not grasp so much of what I love about the original. And we'll get into more specifics about that. We're all kind of dancing around it, but I'm guessing we're on the same thing. But then when I watched it again, I feel like I was able to say to myself, okay, they're going to tell a different story. They're going to tell a story in which, among other things, the character of Aang is fundamentally different. And I asked myself, is that a story I'm interested in hearing? And my end result was, yeah, I think that's an interesting story to hear them tell. But I do agree it's going to be hard because I think I went into this with fairly low expectations of how close it would or wouldn't be to the original. But I agree that the first part of it was just, I mean, the whole thing was also just, I really missed what it was about the original. And so let me see if the biggest thing that I thought was different, let me see if it's the same for you. For me, and we talked about this for those who haven't heard it on our Avatar Primer episode, so much of what makes Aang the character he is that he is, and you know what, forget what I just said, because there's no way to have this conversation without spoiling stuff that comes later. So if you haven't seen the animated show, we are going to spoil you about that, at least in general terms. We'll try to avoid too many specifics.
I will say that I think what you're about to talk about is not what bothered me so much about the beginning.
Okay, sounds good. Well, for me, this was not just the beginning, but the whole 2-episode arc.
Sure. Okay.
What I came to love about the show, and I admit I didn't love it as much, especially in the first season, Aang is a child. He's an incredibly wise child. He's an incredibly powerful child. But he is a child, and he is not, as we first meet him, trauma-stricken. He is joyful. He is able to take joy in small things. And, he gets rescued, and people want to talk to him about the war, and one of the first things he wants to do is go penguin sledding. And there's kind of the spoiler part. We come to realize that he is deeply traumatized. It's just that one of the things he is still the kid who loves doing those things, but also on some level he's focusing on those fun things to not focus on the trauma. And there's a great episode about helping him kind of reconnect with that. And I didn't see any of that in this. I saw Aang as a kid who went through some horrific experiences and carries a lot of guilt and carries a lot of trauma. And I didn't see the whimsy in him at all. I didn't see the joy. And so I think that was and that's where I was like, okay, well, what if I can view this as a very different kind of Aang, but let's see where that goes with the story instead. Okay, that's not what I would have chosen for them to do, but that's an interesting thing for them to do. But what about you guys? Is that at all in line with, Paul, what you were seeing, or is that, as you said, something totally different?
Well, I feel like they tried to have some of that a little bit along the way. I agree that they, the way it came about, or the way that it was revealed, or the fact that, the trauma was kind of front loaded a little bit compared to the series, sort of disrupts that. There was there's a moment where he's like splashing in the water with Katara, right? And like, right. And I think they were kind of trying to go for that. I'm like, okay, there's a little bit of that there. I agree that it's not as much. The thing that, Riki, do you want to respond to that first? And then we'll get into the other separate thing that actually, struck me like I was stricken.
I guess I disagree about the lack of whimsy. I mean,
okay.
I saw the same thing. The scene with Katara practicing her waterbending, and then they end up. I can't remember if she starts teaching him in the animated show this early, but the fact that they were playing in the water, I thought was meant to show that he's not there yet at the point where he wants to learn waterbending. He just wants to have fun.
Yeah, I guess basically I feel like some of that's there, but I think it's just not as much as it's like very prominent in the show, with like the whole penguin sledding and stuff like that. the thing to me that told me that I was watching a very different show was like all these murders in the beginning that none of the protagonists saw. None of the protagonists, none of the people that we see in the present day saw them take place. So the way I feel is like there's absolutely no reason to put them on screen. They're purely gratuitous. They're just telling us what sort of show we're watching. That we're watching a Netflix show where a defenseless person is going to get burned to a crisp on screen. And in a situation that makes no sense for the story, by the way, like it's just so that the arch villain can like spout inane exposition and give the audience like a sense of stakes. So you're like, ooh, people get burned by, by firebending, which the animated series, like very kind of pointedly, occasionally people get burned by firebending, but mostly they just like get knocked down, know? And I think in the animated show, there's a sense of all this tragedy having taken place in the past. And especially in the case of Aang, he's trying to process all these things that happened when he wasn't there. Right. And I feel like by not putting all of that directly on screen, then we're like living that along with Aang.
Right.
And there was a show that we did a while ago, I guess on the Sibling podcast, where somebody dies off screen and the main character isn't there for that. And so we kind of share that feeling of hearing about the death instead of seeing it, and I feel like that can be a useful thing where you actually have the audience experience parts of the story the same way that the protagonist does.
Yeah.
But mostly it just felt like crass and disgusting. And if I wanted to watch that, I just watched The Boys. Like to me, the thing that I love so much about the original show is that it does deal with many of the horrors of the world and the horrors of war, and particularly like the after effects, in a way that has a certain lightness that you rarely get, and that I think this show is deliberately trying not to have. And so I was just like, honestly, like my biggest pet peeve in fiction, also just like things I don't want to watch, are just like defenseless people getting murdered. Like I'm just not interested in that. And I feel like they just very pointedly were like, we want to put this in your face in this way. And I'm like, that's not why I want to watch this show. Yeah. I want to watch this show for other reasons. So I got through that part, and it, I guess warmed up to it. I don't know, word choice, but, there were parts that I really did enjoy, as I said. But just that really started with like I started it with a very bad taste in my mouth, just being like, I don't feel like the producers or writers of this show appreciated the original show the same way I did. Perhaps they appreciated it in some ways that I didn't. That's fine. And they're going to do their own adaptation. Yeah. But it said to me in like one scene, this is not the adaptation that you would want. Not that I even really wanted an adaptation in the first place, though. So,
right. Yeah, I would very much agree with all that. And I think in some ways, I think maybe my seeing the lack of whimsy from Aang is probably influenced by the fact that we start so much darker, because you're right. That's to me, Aang's journey is that we the audience start very whimsical. And as he gets darker and darker, and there's an extent to which like I wanted to see penguin sledding, but I kind of wonder, would it have felt glaringly wrong after just watching like, hey, this kid is penguin sledding and his people all just got, brutally murdered.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it might. I've seen things that I feel like do that, and it doesn't feel right. And in the show, they're able to pull it off because they don't front load the trauma, right? They don't show us right away all of the horrors of what's happened. They let us kind of uncover that along with the characters, and particularly along with Aang. And so it feels different, I think, as a result.
It was so dark, and like literally, like that first sequence in the capital city was like physically dark, and then that matches what we've been talking about, the emotional darkness of the violent acts. And the other part of that I thought was deliberate in the opening sequence was the action elements, the bending.
Oh, yes.
Right? Because the other thing that this show has to overcome is the history of the live action movie, in which the bending was very different and has often been mocked for how simplistic and how not martial arts it was. So I thought the action portrayed with the bending was very good. I'm not sure about the VFX of it. Maybe that's the reason it was so dark, other than just for the mood, is maybe they're trying to hide some of it. But what was on screen looked very good. It looked very much like the action sequences from the animated show in terms of their physicality. So I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it felt to me like they wanted to display some of that and that power and flash early on, because in the show, it takes a while, right?
It does,
It's a bit of a slow burn.
And I do feel like there was a part I was apprehensive about that, and I think I don't like how they do it. In part because what I was thinking is it's adults fighting adults, which is something we almost never see in the original.
True.
There's almost always a teenager or someone else younger than an adult on screen. I will say I want to hear more from you guys at a later point about the martial arts of it. I did think that the fire bending in terms the bending in general, in terms of the CGI and all that, looked very good, much better than the earlier live action. It looked very believable to me. And one thing I did think they did right, because it threw me a bit, but here's my understanding of it. Tell me if you all disagree. And this is a very direct spoiler, so I want to be a little careful about it. But I think Fire Lord Ozai himself said, or someone else said, that at the time they attack the air temple, they're even more powerful than they normally are. And, in that very first scene where the Earth Temple person is trying to get away with the secret plans for the Death Star. I'm sorry, I mean for the invasion of the Earth Kingdom. He's literally hit by a fireball and he's knocked down and then gets back up and his clothes are fine.
Right.
And then later during the attack on the Air Temple, as you said, it is literally getting hit by fire. People are burned badly and they're killed. At first I thought that was inconsistent until I realized later when again the Zuko and General Zhao and all them are attacking, we're back to fireballs can hurt you and can knock you down, but won't always necessarily burn you or certainly not kill you. I think that was because, and I assume they'll tell us more about this later, that during the time they attacked the air nomads, firebending was more powerful.
Well, it was during Sozin's Comet, right? Which got named Sozin's Comet because they attacked the air temple during it.
Right.
And killed all the airbenders. I think Sozin's Comet was already in the sky before the first scene.
It was.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
But maybe it wasn't as close to the planet at the time, and so their strength was gradually increasing. Also, though, they actually did want the guy to get away.
Right, that's true too.
Which is why it then makes no sense that they then captured him and brought him back for the little expository session and, barbecue. So, why didn't they just let him get away? They just had to make it that convincing. Yeah, the other guy got away. Yeah. But it just did, But yeah, I could see a combination of maybe the comet wasn't as close yet, or, they were kind of half-hearted in their efforts. They were trying to make it look good, but they wanted him to at least get the scroll to the other guy to then, which also this plan doesn't make sense and isn't really from the original, right? Where they leak a thing because then they want everybody to think about the Earth Kingdom, but then they think the airbenders are going to go help the Earthbenders. Because he said that then the air nomads and the water tribes will go try and help the Earthbenders, but then they're going to try and attack the airbenders who are having a big festival during the comet, which they have to know increases firebending, right?
Right.
And they know that they're going to plan some attacks. So I don't know. It bothered me from that. They added a bunch of kind of, it works for you?
No. I think you're absolutely right. It doesn't work because when we get to the air temple, they're talking about having to send assistance to the Earth Kingdom. Right. And the monks are talking about shipping Aang away for training because he, as the Avatar, he has to be the one to help stop the Fire Nation. Yeah. So if the Fire Nation just never leaks these plans, they could have done a sneak attack on the air temple like completely. So
right, and they could send 4 sneak attacks. I mean,
I think like plot wise, it would have made more sense if they leak the attack on the Earth Kingdom. The air nomads send their best warriors to the Earth Kingdom, and then the air temple is less defended.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is how I feel like it should have happened. So maybe there's a little bit of weird plotting going on here. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can definitely see that. It did seem, if you want to show off your CGI bending early, I totally get that. But I agree, doing it in this way, having it be so dark. And I guess that's all. Here's what I think is going to, for me, be the fundamental challenge of this is, in general, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, here's this fascinating story that was told primarily for one audience. We are now going to take that story and tell it for a different audience, which will in some ways change the story, but we'll try to be as true to that story as we can be. And often that is like, it's written as a kid's story or a YA story, and now they're going to tell it for a more adult audience or whatever it is. And I think that often works. But I think, and again, as we all talked about for quite a while, and Paul, you really convinced me of this many years ago, this story, it's not that it's a kid's story. It's not that it's a story told for kids. It is fundamentally a story about a child. And that can be told in a more adult way than the cartoon was, than the animated show was, but you still have to keep that. It is about someone who can be both very wise and very strong and still have the whimsy. And as you said, maybe there's more of it there than I'm giving credit for. But I think what you said, Paul, about them not getting that point of the show, I'm going to give them some more chance to see if they do, or to see if they're going to try and say, what if we make it a different point? Mm-hmm. But it definitely is not that original one. And that's sad.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much how I feel. It's like, it's a show where the protagonists are kids, or teenagers. Right. And like, there's only so much like you can really that story is really only going to work in certain ways. And there's an extent to which I feel like maybe the original series was the perfect, marriage of medium and story, where this is a story that was meant to be told in animation, and that trying to adapt it for live action is just a fundamentally difficult idea, if nothing else. Right. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I don't know. In terms of like taking a story and making it darker or whatever, like if it's not just for the sake of making it darker, I mean, I don't know. I love the Dark Knight Batman. That's not who Batman always was, Mm-hmm. I love the Netflix Daredevil. That's not who Daredevil ever always was. It's like, I'm not opposed to like having different versions of characters. I guess it's like when there's an animated series, then you're just trying to make like the live action adaptation. It feels a little different than when it's like comic book characters that have had 40 iterations already in the comics, and then you're just adapting them in different ways, Yeah. But as I did say, though, I think there are some things that it's doing very well. And I mean, I am going to give it the chance to like, hopefully, even if it doesn't capture some of these things that I love, I do hope that it manages to capture some of them, and then maybe even bring something that was absent or kind of latent in the original show, but like we could get more of, right, than we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is coming out at a difficult time, because we had the Netflix live action One Piece within the past 6 months, I'm going to say. Mm-hmm. And that was such a success at capturing the essence of the characters of the One Piece manga and anime. And it just like blew everything away in terms of all of the other adaptations we've had, like Cowboy Bebop, Yu Yu Hakusho came out after. And so like this is coming out at a time when it's like, oh, now we have this example of something like it finally succeeded. Whereas like so many other anime to live actions have not succeeded. So it could have struck a couple of months before, and been successful, right? But now it's like when the MCU happened. It's like, oh, the MCU worked. How about if we try to make the DCU work or the Sony Spider-Verse universe work? And they don't. And it's like, well, why can't we be the MCU? Right? So it's difficult when one like very prominent example succeeds so well. And now like it's probably even harder to follow that up at this time.
Yeah.
And I personally am judging it on that. Like, oh, well, it's not quite One Piece yet.
Yeah, I think it's fair. And I think, I don't know One Piece, but I know for Cowboy Bebop, for example, it is animated, but is by no means a kid's show. Like, if someone asked me what's a good show to have their 8-year-old watch, like, I think some 8-year-olds would enjoy it. But I think, it deals with very adult topics and very adult themes. And, so does Avatar, so do a lot of other kids' shows. But to me, Cowboy Bebop it's animated, but there's nothing about it that says, oh, this is primarily aimed at kids in the same way someone like Avatar, I think, was. And in some ways, I think, like, it's always weird talking about that separation between the two, because I think the best shows are ones that maybe aimed at one audience, but that all audiences can enjoy. Yeah, which I think Avatar very much was.
Yeah, it has something for various different people, right?
Yeah. When I watched The Muppet Show as a kid, my mother absolutely loved it. And then when I grew up and watched it again as an adult, I realized there was a whole layer of meaning and jokes and references that as a 6-year-old, I was totally missing that my mother loved, Let's talk about the bending just a little bit more. Paul, as a martial artist yourself, as someone who's talked a lot about this and studied a lot, I know one thing you always said that you loved about the animated show was how each of the 4 benders, it was their own martial art, but it was clearly drawn on different martial arts from our own world. And each of their martial arts seemed to really fit the ethos and philosophy of the different element that they were doing. It did seem to me like the movements were different between the different groups, but as someone with a lot more training and understanding of this, how did that look to you?
Fine. I guess I'd say overall, the martial arts mostly looked good to me, believable. I think pretty much everybody who was doing action was moving well. It felt well choreographed. There were some kind of conspicuous cuts where I felt like the fluidity between the martial arts, like the actual physical act of bending, and then the result of the bending, right? The elemental result, doesn't feel as fluid to me as it does in the animation. I mean, part of that is because you're layering, VFX on top of physical action, right? Whereas in the animation, you're just drawing the whole thing. So, not to minimize that achievement, because I think in the animated series it's fantastic, but just that to me seems like a more straightforward thing where you're working in one medium. Here you basically have 2 forms of media that you're laying one on top of the other, and I think it's harder to do. I haven't rewatched the M. Night Shyamalan adaptation recently. I mean, I maybe watched 5 to 10 minutes, and I was like, I just can't. Which, to be honest, is how I felt in the beginning of this. But then when I got back to it, I was like, okay, there's definitely strong things here. I mean, there's 2 performances that I think are arguably better than in the original, and definitely some stuff. But in terms of the martial arts, like, it seemed fine. Katara isn't really that powerful yet, so it makes sense that she doesn't, her movements, they don't show too much of that yet, right? I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing more of that. It does kind of develop in the first 2, but there's some spots where they kind of cut from the result of her bending to then her kind of like holding her arms, and I'm kind of like, okay, that was a choice. And I think it was because they wanted it to be a surprise, specifically like where she, brings the water geyser up to knock aside Zuko's fireball to try and knock them off Appa, right? But and that's just that. But to me, that, like, maybe that's more editing than like choreography, But overall, I thought the choreography was good, and better than. I mean, I would compare it more to the 2010 adaptation than the original series. Was like felt a cut above this so far, but also it's like it's animation. You can have people move however you want. Here it's like you actually have to have people doing those stunts. And I think in terms of them just being human beings doing all of that, so far so good is what I would say.
Well, especially because one thing I was thinking about was that, the voice actor you cast has nothing to do with the physicality of the animated character on screen.
Yes.
Whereas there are some people who are cast who I think were quite good, but I don't think of them as martial artists. Like, the actor who's playing Uncle Appa, Uncle Mr. Kim, Paul Sung-Young Lee, the actor who played Mr. Kim in Kim Convenience and has been many, many other things. I think he's fantastic as Uncle Iroh. I'm really liking him. I don't know if he's ever studied martial arts in any way. Maybe he has, but he certainly hasn't considered that in any of the other stuff.
He has?
Really?
Okay. I'm going to talk about Paul Sung-Young Lee for a moment.
Here we go.
Yep.
Because I was very disinterested in the idea of another live-action adaptation of The Last Airbender. And I saw some video, someone talking about something. It might have been on his, some Canadian awards show where he's getting an award for playing, Kim Sang-il on Kim's Convenience. And I was just like, this dude would be a great Iroh. He would be a great Uncle Iroh. And one of the reasons was, he's got the build, right? He's got a certain size to him. Yeah. At the time I was thinking he can definitely do an accent that feels convincing and doesn't feel really fake. And he's obviously chosen not to, and to, just speak his normal Canadian English. Right. And that's fine. I don't think that really, matters one way or the other, but if you're going to have someone do an accent, you don't want someone to do a terrible accent, right? You really don't want that. And he could do comedy while also being serious. And he can move well. Because in Kim's Convenience, the first season, there's a Hapkido episode where he goes and does Hapkido.
Oh, you're right.
And I could tell the actor's he's moving. He can move. And so I can definitely see him be someone who, is mostly going to be kind of, have a cup of jasmine tea. And then at some point, is going to be did I ever tell you how I got the name Dragon of the West? Yeah. It's more of a demonstration, really, and then just be a total badass. And it's oh, yeah, okay, yeah. So yeah, anyway, that's why I watched the series. And he can do that. But he's not a martial artist first and foremost, which is the Aang that they cast in the M. Night Shyamalan one, sent an audition tape that was basically just a martial arts demonstration, Yeah. But I think your point that you were getting to that I so graciously interrupted was that you need actors who can act, but then also can do action. Right. And those two things don't always live in the same body. Yeah. Right. They rarely do. It's because that's two totally different skills that you need to be able to put together. And of course you can have stunt doubles, but you don't want to do too much with stunt doubles because then you never have the character's face in the shot and it can be jarring. Right. And, unless it's Din jarring and then it works. Yeah. But sorry, I'm on.
But even the basics, of course they're going to have stunt doubles. Of course there's probably going to be some wire fu going on here. But even just the basic forms of the kata, when they take their stances and poses, that has to be believable. That they know their stuff. So for sure. I do think it's very important. And that's why casting live action, I think the most prominent example for me is going to be Fire Lord Ozai in the animated shows played by Mark Hamill, right? Fantastic voice actor. Yeah. But now, at the end of episode 2 here, we got the image. We got Daniel Day Kim is going to be Ozai. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to seeing some of his fights and looking forward to seeing him take his shirt off for one of those fights, right? And I don't know, the martial arts, even though I didn't like the storytelling style of the starting in the past, I did like that we got to see trained airbenders at the air temple fight off the Fire Nation soldiers. because in the animated show, it's only Aang. I don't think we ever get to see a flashback of the airbenders fighting. Maybe one of the avatars, right? But seeing like this very prominent martial arts battle between fire and air, and the movements of the air monks, to me was very reminiscent of I believe the Talo in Shang-Chi, the way that they moved in the circular fashions, and of course both literally manipulating, airflow and causing circular wind patterns around them. Like I really love that.
Yeah, I can see that. And I mean, I was really struck by that battle. And even in that early scene, which again, the first time I was just like, why is this here? Then I went back and rewatched. Earthbending looks terrifying, as it should. Like, the ability to like throw rocks, throw boulders, throw, sharp pebbles at people, and then just to pull up a wall to help keep you safe. In some ways, to me, the only one that hasn't really looked badass so far is waterbending. And that's because, as Paul, you were saying, so far we've only seen Katara, and she's still learning right now.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I actually didn't see that whole battle, because that's the part that I'm like, oh, here's the genocide. I'll skip through the genocide. But like, maybe I'll go back and watch it at some point. But yeah, I think seeing a lot of airbending sounds cool. I mean, the thing in the original series is that it's like, the whole point is that it's the last airbender, right? But like, this does provide more context for that. And to me, it kind of, having Aang be the only airbender that we ever see, I think made sort of Katara and everybody else who lives in this generation, their point of view, we can see their point of view because they've all only ever seen this one airbender, and we've only seen this one airbender. Right. Whereas now we've seen, centuries apart and, a score of airbenders. It was anything in the original series about Aang being like a super powerful airbender? Did that ever come up? Or is that kind of something that they either added or is in the graphic novels?
I think they added it or was in the graphic novels because and granted, I didn't memorize it, but I watched the original animated just a couple of days ago. And one of the things about the episode where he like, the event, except for the whole Earth Kingdom spy thing, like which is totally made up. The attack on the Air Kingdom is something like and the plotting of it all is something that we do find out about. And certainly Aang going there is something we see. But, and we see in flashback him, running away when he's told he's going to be the Avatar. Part of why I think he in the animated show he's deeply surprised because he doesn't think of himself as better than everybody else, right? And I think that was something that was lacking here.
This felt very Anakin Skywalker, the way they talked about him when they were like he's the youngest Airbender ever to receive his tattoos and stuff like that.
Like, not just the chosen one, but like the chosen one of chosen ones.
Yeah. Not only is he the Avatar, he's the greatest, the youngest, greatest airbender we've ever had.
Right.
Yeah, because I think part of the thing in the original is that he's a good airbender, but he's made the Avatar. They know that he's the Avatar for things that have nothing to do with the quality of his bending.
Right. Yeah. It's just like a sign or something.
And it's a weird decision because he doesn't have to be the greatest airbender. He's the last airbender. So
right.
In this world, he's literally the only one who can do this now.
Right. And so he's now the greatest.
Yeah.
He's also the best anybody's ever seen.
Exactly.
Because no one living ever saw those other people. So.
Right. He doesn't have to be the best that ever was.
So that does feel like a weird choice to make because it sets him up as special beyond being the Avatar, which I feel like should already be special enough.
Yeah, me too.
It also felt like, again, I don't want the show to be all about making a 12-year-old boy feel guilty and terrible and us thinking he's terrible, but it let him off the hook for him leaving a little bit more than the animated show did.
It did.
In that he's just like, I just need to kind of like go fly to clear my head. And that he specifically says, let's go back. He's like on his way back when the story happens.
Right. Because in the animated show, doesn't he like leave, like actually run away and like leave a letter? Right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that what happened?
Mm-hmm.
So he actually
ran. Do this.
Whereas
Here
this,
he's like, I'm just going to go for a drive, and
Yeah.
and it leads to a very, and this is important because it leads to a very completely different sense of responsibility and guilt for this character going forward. Like he didn't abandon his tribe. Like he just happened to not be there when the attack happened, and then got caught up in a storm.
Yeah. At the same time, if he's not like the greatest of all time, like then it's like, what could he have done in that moment if he'd stayed at the Southern Air Temple in the animated series? Whereas here, it's like, if he's that good, maybe it wouldn't have been the difference, but like he probably could have helped, a little more than just like, he's just a 12-year-old kid who's an airbender, but isn't like the greatest. And, I don't know.
Well, I was just going to add that, like, as Star Wars fans, did we all get like the Order 66 flashbacks during that scene?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When they're hurting the kids, and I'm just like, I see the lightsaber lighting up.
Yeah. Well, it felt like, again, this was a way in which it was choosing to tell a different story, and it made me a bit sad because it seems to be leaving out what I think is one of the best parts, at least in some, or at least changing. Because I think you're right, Paul. The public perception of why has the Avatar not been with us for the last 100 years is somewhat inaccurate. And there's this weird thing of Aang feels guilty for something he did, but it's not quite what everybody else is mad at the Avatar for. And it's why I really missed. It feels like this show is basically doing we're just going to tell the key parts of the story, and we're going to leave out all the side quests. And the side quest that we missed, that is part of the story these episodes tell, is the trial of the Avatar. In the original, part of what happens when he goes to Kyoshi Island is he finds out that there's an island right next door that hates the Avatar because, as they see it, Kyoshi came and killed someone who was very important to that town some time ago. And in going that, he connects to Kyoshi as part of his trying to figure out what really happened. And it really opens the door to these real questions of sometimes what the Avatar needs to do is not what the people want the Avatar to do. And sometimes the Avatar might be wrong about what that is, and that there's a tension there, and that has a lot to do with how people perceive the Avatar. And to me, it's one of my favorite episodes from the original series. And I was sad that it's not here because I think it foretells that a lot of those sort of side quests are not going to be here. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're going to get Secret Tunnel, much as I love it, but that's at least a year away. But also, I just think it's such an essential story.
I was reading
you
a book
and Sarah
last night,
both. And
the phrase "secret tunnel" was literally in the book because the characters go down a secret tunnel, and I might have sung it out loud for a moment.
You gotta.
I couldn't help it. I was like, it was reflexive. But yeah, they're doing 8 episodes, right? They're not doing a 20 episode season. The episodes are twice as long, so you should be able to cover, or even 3 times, right? The first one was over an hour. You should be able to cover a similar amount of ground. I kind of liked the way they did Kyoshi here. Mm-hmm. I felt like it worked, like just that whole episode, that second episode. The second episode definitely worked a lot more for me than the first one, although again, like Aang just like turning into Kyoshi also felt to me like just an excuse to like show extremely impressive bending before any of the characters are that strong yet.
That was weird. Like, I was not expecting that to physically be Aang's body doing that.
Yeah, I thought that was very weird. Like, and there wasn't any look of like it being an apparition. It's like, no, he just literally morphed into Kyoshi. And, the whole past lives thing was never my favorite part of the whole story. But like, I do like Kyoshi as a character. And like, when I watched that, I was just kind of like, why don't you just do a Kyoshi series? Like, if you wanted to tell a different story that was fundamentally different from Aang's story, why not just do Kyoshi's story? Like, it could be great. Like, you could just do a great Kyoshi. Yeah, you could do a bunch of different avatars, and maybe they will. And maybe this was their sort of like, did you like that? Well, guess what? We have a spin-off coming, taking place 200 years earlier, you know?
I mean, I thought the actress playing Kyoshi was great. And I will say what I would hope would be a part of it, because I thought it was really well done. You know, last time when we talked about this, one thing we said was that we all kind of wished that we had more of Suki and, you know, of her story.
Oh,
and
gosh.
I loved how they did Suki's story.
Yeah, but now, as I did too. I loved the character in this one, the live action. I loved the scenes with Sokka, but that's gonna make me miss her even more. Like,
when she's not around,
she's not gonna show up. I mean, okay, spoilers, right? Like, she's not gonna show up again for a while. Maybe not for the rest of this season, and then, yeah, like this is a problem when you adapt something that already exists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that these two characters and the actors in particular just sold that. I loved their interactions, and it was, I mean, I'll say it, like, it was hot, right? Like, it was that the tension was there between them. It was beautifully done, beautifully acted. And now it's like, nope, like, Sokka's going off to the Northern Water Tribe. Like, their adventures are going to happen. You'll see Suki later.
Yeah. I feel almost like they did that too well, because then things that might happen at the end of this season that we won't talk about yet will kind of feel like, I don't know. I mean, maybe they can really sell that too. Who knows? We'll see.
And this is also the problem with a full season television show. Like, back in the day when you had a 26 episode television show and you filmed the episodes, you know, kind of one at a time.
Yeah.
If you had an episode like this and you saw the interaction between these actors and said, ooh, I like this. Let's bring this character back, or like get back earlier than we had kind of plotted out. Like, that's the kind of change that would happen in those TV shows.
Yeah.
Naturally.
Like Arrow, the character Felicity was like just barely going to be just a thing. And then they were like, oh, everybody loves this and the chemistry is great. Let's just like make her a regular. And now she's like in the comics.
Yeah. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Spike was supposed to be a one-of villain of the week.
Yeah.
And he became a part of the regular cast.
Yeah.
In those ways, if they do go pretty far afield, I'd be okay with it. Like, at one point, I was watching with Mary, and she was like, "Wait, is Suki just going to join them?" And I was like,
"I wish. I hope
when he gets to the end of the season, that'd be great." I think they could just not be doing anything with her. I think that'd be a mistake. I think we could have her show up again in various ways. I think we might get like her doing things with like the spirit of Kyoshi in some way at Kyoshi's temple. Like, I'm hopeful.
Yeah, you could show some other stuff that happens not within the presence of the central crew.
Yeah,
you know?
maybe.
Yeah, for sure. But her martial arts were spot on too, by the way. Like that, she was like, she could move well. The makeup was amazing. I was like, why are you taking the makeup off? Like, that felt like we just want to show
took it off in like one wipe too.
Mary was so upset about that. And
magical
having
makeup.
Myself also like tried for 20 minutes to get all the makeup off, but gone to sleep still knowing some of it's there. Like, I want to buy those makeup wipes, but and they did change the story pretty dramatically. Sokka is arrogant and obnoxious, but he's not specifically sexist.
Right.
You know, but I was okay with that. Like, I felt like they're giving Sokka a different journey, and in some ways, I always got the sense that there's a tension at this point in their story, but they don't really get together until much later, in part because she sees how much he's grown up. And but I'm like, look, I have that story. This is just going to be a different version of it in a different way. And so, yeah, in some ways that I was a lot more okay with than some of the other changes we talked about.
Yeah, but it's a shame because the version of the story that these characters portrayed, to me, like the natural conclusion that I felt would have really worked here was Suki joining them at the end of this episode.
Right.
Like, just some scene with her mother and her mother having already packed her bags and saying like, you need to go with them, or like whatever, like tearful goodbye between them, and then like she runs after Appa, like, I'm coming too.
Like if you were writing the series from scratch, that would just be like, oh yeah, she should join Team Avatar.
Yeah.
Right? Like that would just make sense.
It was that good.
Yeah.
I wonder, tell me if you guys think this is true. I'm starting to feel like I would like this show as an adaptation a lot more if the movie had been much better. And what I mean by that is, Paul, kind of what you were saying about how part of why the Dark Knight version of Batman works, not that Christopher Nolan was the first to come up with it. There have been comics that went that dark, but it's also that we have so many other versions of Batman, including on screen. We still live in a world where a lot of folks, and I don't think this is anything wrong with them, it's just different perspectives. Like, I would love them to see Avatar, but they're like, I just don't like animation. Or they'd probably watch the first couple episodes and have a reaction much like I do of, this is really a kid's show and I'm not here for it. And I think part of what I was hoping with it, I think I would really love for there to be a live action I could show those folks and be like, hey, this has all the main points of the animated. It's not animated, so you get to enjoy it and we can talk about it and just have more of that story out in the world. And I like them telling a different kind of an Avatar, The Last Airbender story, but I feel like I want the first live action that's actually a good live action to be a lot truer to the story, and then I want to see things that go further afield, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I feel like, I don't know, I'll circle back to what I said earlier, like, maybe that story is an animated story. Maybe it's just not a story possible, that you can execute in the same way live action. Like, if you literally just took the same script and tried to have all the characters do exactly the same thing, like, I don't know that it would work. Maybe it would. Maybe if I'd seen One Piece and liked it, I would feel that way. I mean, having seen the series Kenshin and then watching the movies, I was really surprised the extent to which they could capture the essence of the characters who are, there's a lot of like very anime specific things, right, in the series. And they have a lot of those in the live action, which also has like, I mean, one of them has some like bloody fighting scenes, you know, although it's very different in tone from the others for various reasons. But like, it somehow, I feel like that felt to me like a huge achievement and like a lot to ask, you know, and I didn't think they would do it. And then they did. Maybe not perfectly, but very well. Here, I feel like actually capturing the original animated series in all of its, everything about it that was it, I feel like would probably be really hard to capture in live action. Cowboy Bebop, I think they could have done a more kind of direct adaptation instead of taking some of the liberties that they did, because of the nature of the show. Like you said before, it's a different sort of show, you know, it has a different feel. I've always felt that like Airbender and Kenshin actually have there's a similar something to them, something in their essence that feels kind of connected.
Well, and Kenshin might be the perfect example then, because I absolutely love the live action Kenshin.
Yeah.
I do not at all like the I was going to say the kiddie version of Kenshin. Yeah, because, and I think that's not fair, but to me,
I agree.
I say it's the first thing that came to mind, but to me, the Kenshin animated show very much feels like a kid's show. And it makes me feel like I'm watching something that I'm just too old to enjoy. Right, and that's probably my personal failing. But to me, the movies were much, much more mature in ways that are, and part of that's also because probably it's about adults and it's about
there's kids and there's like a teenager and whatever, but you know, it's like, it definitely, I agree. And I don't think failing is fair. I think preference. Let's go with preference. I mean, you can say whatever you want, but like, I feel like, people have preferences. Some people just can't watch animation at all. And like, I try to dispel the notion that like it's necessarily for children, but like, if you don't like it and you give it a chance and you still don't like it, like you don't like it, that's fine. You know, also the first like 20, 30 episodes of Kenshin are like quite different from the next like 30 or so and whatever. But, I agree. It's like, it's nice when there is a live action version of something that people who just can't with the animation or a specific animation can enjoy. Like, cause to me, I mean, The Last Airbender is a story that I would like more people to enjoy because I think it's a great story and I think there's a lot of value there, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, they're trying, they're making choices and, you know, we'll see how it goes.
So I just want to get some clarification. The Kenshin was an anime, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to draw a distinction here. When I say anime, I mean a Japanese product.
yes, and the live action adaptation was also Japanese film.
Right.
Yes,
because
so it's not the same.
Yeah.
Sure.
And I'm not trying to be a snob here, in terms of like, this is anime. Like, Avatar is not anime because it's not Japanese. I don't care about that distinction. But when something is written for a Japanese audience specifically, like it's very different. So I'm wondering if some of that is maybe what Matthew didn't enjoy, because one of the things that strikes me, like we're talking about Sokka being less misogynistic in the live action. And while you were talking, I was thinking, if the original Avatar had been a Japanese anime, Sokka would have been a pervert. Like you have to have one character that's like a pervert, and like that's 100% who that would have been.
Yeah.
So even the animated Avatar version of Sokka is like, okay, like I can live with that. Because I don't need this character that just like nosebleeds every time he sees a beautiful woman.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's talk some more about the casting. Riki, what did you think about some of the casting choices and how well they did or didn't work?
Okay, I'm gonna say this. I love Paul Sun-hyun Lee. I love him to death. And I was excited when I saw his name attached to this. Didn't love his portrayal of Iroh quite yet, but I'm a huge Iroh stan. So it's like it's just not quite there yet. I don't know what it is. I may have to like watch it again and specifically watch the Iroh scenes. And maybe like I haven't seen Kim's Convenience, so maybe you all who have seen it can chime in a little more with his performance and like what he brings to the table. Like it just something wasn't there. Something was missing, and I'm not quite sure what it is quite yet.
I really liked his performance, but I also felt like I needed to.
It was a good performance. Like his acting was fine. Maybe it's the writing. I just don't know quite yet.
I don't know if gravitas is the right word, but it's something like he felt more like a peer than kind of a wise old man, who is Uncle Iroh, especially in the earlier seasons. Well, there's only 3, but he strikes me very much as that kind of like, he's a little bit kooky, but very, very wise. Like there's almost Yoda-like aspect to him.
Yes. Yeah.
That I felt, and maybe it may also be because I've seen him play, Appa, Mr. Kim for so long, who is also, he's not a kooky old man. He's a very kind, very loving old man who's a bit of a buffoon sometimes. And that, to me, those
is like probably about our age, right?
Say again?
Just for the record, he's probably about our age. He's like in his 40s or early 50s. Just saying.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And that may also be part of it. Is to me, like, Iroh is someone like in his like 60s or 70s, but maybe it's, I want to give him the chance, and I think he has the chance to really be good. And I thought there was nothing about him that I was like bad. I was just like, this isn't quite striking me in that way.
Right. And it was like I said last time, Iroh's my favorite character. So it's like there's a very high bar for me in terms of like an Iroh performance. And I think what you mentioned, the kookiness, I that could be part of it. I think this portrayal of Iroh was much more, I don't know, like it's not necessarily, I guess, deadpan. Yeah, like he talks about tea, but there's it just, maybe it's the Zuko as well. Like he has to play off Zuko in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And there was only really one moment where I felt like they got that really right, was when they're walking around the village and he's talking about food and says something like very serious. And then partway through, he's like, oh, sticky rice.
Yeah.
And just like walks away. And the face that Zuko made, like that was their relationship to me. And maybe just because we have fewer episodes, like they can't sprinkle those in as much or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. I felt like in the second episode, they were really getting it, especially in that spot, in some other spots as well. And then they showed the bamboo leaf wrapped sticky rice later, which makes me hungry. But I mean, I have a theory and I don't like it, but like, I think it's possible that the sort of feeling that we get from Iroh and the difference between the animated series and here is like his accent. Like, I think that is probably an unfortunately significant part of how how someone's words are received, right? And I think there is this perception that if you have like an older, wise, generally Asian, but it could be a number of different backgrounds, with an accent that sounds somehow different to what you might be used to hearing day to day. I think there's a certain sort of wisdom that's ascribed to that, particularly in the realm of martial arts, and I don't want it to be that way, and I know that he could have done an accent. I mean, I know that the actor has done many different accents throughout his career, and he specifically said that the first time he did a Korean accent or agreed to do a Korean accent is when he did Kim's Convenience, because it always felt like kind of not right to him, and I know like the idea of like Asian American, Asian Canadian actors like having to do an accent all the time is like this very unfortunate typecasting thing that finally we're somewhat getting past, right? Mm-hmm. But I do think like a huge part of the original Uncle Iroh was like the performance of Mako, right? Like, and I believe that was just the actor's natural speaking voice, right? And his accent, because I don't know for certain, but like I've been sleeping with like Frasier running in the background, and I'm like, that's Uncle Iroh, and he's playing like a book editor or publisher or something, and he sounds the same, the same way you can hear Batman if you hear Cheers. Kevin Conroy's in an episode, but so I feel like, and when you say Yoda, I remember a time past when I was talking about Yoda and whatever, and like, I mean, like, why do you think George Lucas or whoever actually wrote the dialogue for Yoda, like, had Yoda not use standard English grammar?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, it's probably to make him seem sort of different, and it's probably kind of supposed to be, I mean, it's not the same kind of grammar that someone of any particular language would necessarily speak with, right? But like, I do think it's to try and kind of replicate that feeling where people get this sense of kind of perceived wisdom. I mean, ironically, people also often ascribe incorrectly the like ignorance to people who have various accents, right? And so it can swing both ways. But I do feel like that was a part of the character in terms of the way most people experience the character and see the character that shouldn't be an integral part of the character. But I think, for me, I think I had to sit with Paul Seong-Hyung Lee as Iroh for like a full episode before in the second episode I was ready to be like, okay, this is who Iroh is here. Yeah. And I feel it. His interaction with Zuko, and I think really Dallas Liu brings a lot to that as well. That dynamic, I feel, is going to be one of my favorite things throughout the show. And it did take me a little bit to get into, because I didn't know what he was going to go with, and I also think that the writing is not the best in terms of dialogue overall. And, as an actor, you work with what you're given, right? And then maybe you can make some suggestions or whatever. But if the dialogue's a little clunky, maybe, then it's probably just harder to bring it, kind of, I think,
Yeah, I mean, I think you are right that the accent of the original Iroh played by Mako, and it's weird because in that show, very few other people from the Fire Nation had any kind of accent, including his own brother.
Yeah, his younger brother doesn't. Right?
Played by Mark Hamill, right? He just played it straight up as he usually does.
Yeah, it's just the Joker.
Yeah. And I agree with everything you said about how, Asian actors were or are sometimes still often forced into roles where they have to play it a certain way, a certain accent. So I do appreciate it, but it is something about his voice and something about the accent combined with his like cadence and speaking speed just made Iroh, right? And it's hard to replicate that and have that without the accent. I think it is part of it, no doubt.
Yeah. No, I think it's very true. I think I hadn't thought about it, but I think you're right. Like I hate that, but it's part of just the way we're all taught and things like that. And it's funny because I think you're right that it is primarily experienced with Asian accents and things like that, but definitely not exclusively. Because one of the ones that I was thinking about is that often, especially in a lot of the TV and movies I grew up with, there's a time when the character will go see their Jewish grandfather. And I couldn't for the life of me tell you what it was, but there's some movie I saw in the 90s where it was a Jewish grandfather, but clearly like the family had been in New York for a number of generations, or no, they weren't even in New York because often the Jewish accent and the New York accent are often intermingled. Yeah. But this person just had like a kind of standard American accent, and it felt completely wrong to me. Because I associated, wisdom coming, and granted, this is in part because my Uncle Lou had that kind of an accent, and he was very much the wise old man of our family.
Right.
He's been passed away for 20 years. We still tell stories of, what Uncle Lou would say and things like that. So, yeah. Yeah, so we'll see where that goes. I do think that the casting, as you were bringing up, Paul, of Commander Zhao and of Zuko is phenomenal. I heard people online complaining that Zuko's scar is a lot more understated than it is, but I think it's perfect. I think, again, it's the kind of thing like in anime, you have to go, not anime, in animation, you sometimes have to go over the top a little bit with a scar. And I think this looks much more realistic, but still incredibly, like affecting. Like this person's clearly been through something terrible.
Yeah.
I thought Sokka, again, we talked about the Sokka Suki chemistry. I really liked Sokka.
Yeah, Sokka, okay, played by Ian Ousley. He just nailed it, right? Like of all the characters, I think he is like the most similar to the animated version of the character. Like the look, the way he talks, like his voice, the comedy. Like I just probably my favorite of the characters so far is the Sokka character.
Yeah. I think in part because I don't hate him. It's curious what you said about how like every anime has to have certain things. I think a lot of American animation often has to have that one guy who's a chauvinist and he's arrogant and he thinks that he's the hot shit with all the ladies, and like Wally West in the Wally West version of Flash in Young Justice is what comes to mind most. But often there's that character and you're just constantly like eye rolling. In part because it's so over the top, but it's animation. And that's kind of how Sokka comes off to me in the first couple episodes of Avatar, The Last Airbender animated. And he changes rather quickly. And I've always wondered if that was always the idea, or if they were getting test audiences early that were like, this Sokka guy is just kind of painful to have on screen. But I felt, and maybe this is just the way they're playing a story, maybe it's the actor, in this, he's not arrogant in the way that just I don't want to watch the way he was early in the show. To me, I much more feel the weight of this is a 13-year-old boy who was told, this is a boy of like 15, 16 who was told at 13 you have to protect the village, and who took that on. And it did things to him in the way it'll often do to any person of any age, but especially a 13-year-old. But I felt much more sympathetic to him and like eager to see him grow than I did with the animated.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has the arrogance and the chip on his shoulder, like without the side of misogyny.
Yeah.
Right? Which, like, we were talking about that in the pre-episode, right? Where it's like, yeah, I feel like he needed the kind of arrogance it's not even arrogance, it's like the faux cockiness that's the clearly kind of compensating for the fear of inadequacy, basically. The weight of this responsibility with the knowledge that he might not be up to it,
Yeah.
And like that to me feels like an important part of the character, and I think they've showed that nicely without like it having to be this whole misogynistic thing, which is nice. Like, I feel like they got the essence and left out some of the specifics. And that is what I'm looking for most of the time, is like, okay, what drives this character? What's kind of really important about this character? And then like kind of what's sort of just like surface, you know, oh, his scar's a little smaller. Okay, whatever. You know, like her head tails aren't long enough. Okay, well, they're probably really heavy on a live action.
Yeah, for Sokka. Yeah,
you know, like, so to me, it feels like a good instance of getting the essence of the character without necessarily trying to match all the specifics. I do feel like I could get a little bit more humor, hopefully, as we go along, maybe.
Yeah. I feel like they're definitely missing the misogyny, but it also felt like in the animated show, it feels like his confidence is so overblown that it is often humorous, because it's often like Katara and Aang, or both of them, or sometimes even Toph, who we'll meet later, rolling their eyes at just how ridiculous he is. And that he did take control of the town and defend them quite well. You know, he is very competent in this. And so, yeah, it just feels like it's just dialed down from like a 10 to a 7 in a way I really appreciate.
Sure.
What do you guys think of Aang?
Medium. I mean, like, obviously, like a very important character, but I think given how young the actor is, Gordon Cormier, it's more important that he not be bad than he be good.
Yeah,
does that make sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
like, I think he's doing the job that he needs to do, and that's fine. Like, he doesn't need to carry the show, but he needs to be there throughout the entire show. And like, I don't hate it, I don't love it, and that's what he needs to do.
Yeah, I mean, Aang is one of my favorite characters of all time, and I don't even know if he's one of my favorite characters, or if he's just one of the characters I feel like I identify with the most in some ways. Mm-hmm. Like, those are kind of two different things, right? There's characters that I love that I'm like, yeah, I think the Joker's a great character, but I can't say I identify with him, you know? Yeah. But like Aang is a character who like feels important to me, and I feel like so far this feels like Aang. I feel like there's not as much of the whimsy as there could be, not as much of the lightness. I think some of the dialogue, some of the lines are not great, and I don't fault the actor for that. I think he moves well. You know, I'm not like blown away, but I feel like that's a role where you have time, and like kind of like what Riki was saying, like sort of like get the job done, and like to me, like don't blow it, kid. You know, just don't blow it, and it'll be okay, because you get more to build on as you go on. And I think one thing about young actors, and not necessarily just in terms of 12 versus 24 versus 36, but like in terms of within their career, right? People who haven't been acting for decades and don't have the most experience. I think when paired with actors who have more experience and do bring a lot, I think it's like a learning opportunity. It's an opportunity for growth, and there's something to play off of. And that's one of the things that I think is so challenging here, having multiple young actors working together. You know, that's going to be harder. But I did think like his scenes with Gyatso, like I found them moving, you know, like
I thought those were very well done.
Well, I was definitely going to bring that up. The addition of that interaction earlier on and having Gyatso on screen really worked. And that actor, hang on, I got it written down right here. Keisu Lim is Monk Gyatso.
Yeah.
Absolutely, like, perfect. And I can understand why they're going to use that as their Luke use the Force. They're going to keep like using his voice, right? The line he says of like, you are strong and kind and generous.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's going to be repeated multiple times, because it's perfect. It's a perfect line for the character and for the delivery.
And they're like, I don't want to have the power. And it's like, that's why you're going to be a great avatar. I just want to be your friend. And he's like, you will always be my friend.
Yeah. Oh, it hit so hard.
Yeah.
It did. And I had to pause it, and I had to like talk to my television and say, are you really going to do this to me, Gyatso?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I was thinking about in terms of the acting is also whimsy is really hard to do on screen, especially for a fairly newer actor. And I mean, very clear, I'm not saying this is the actor's fault, but whimsy can be done very badly, especially by a young kid. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just see if you can hear in your mind Jake Lloyd Anakin saying, yippee! Like,
or now this is pod racing. No, you just blew up a ship. That's not pod racing.
Yeah, those are terrible lines of dialogue, but also, again, I do not. If the director could get Natalie Portman to give a bad acting performance, the acting is definitely not Jake Lloyd's fault, but those scenes come off as cringeworthy in part, because of that. And I think so. There's an extent to which, like, I want whimsy. I am okay without whimsy if my option is bad or cloying whimsy. Well, and so the last major actress we have. So the last major actor we haven't talked about yet is Katara, and I want to start with her. The first thing I'll say about her, I want to talk about her in her own right, but big spoiler here. So skip ahead if you really don't want to be spoiled, but there is going to be the idea of romance between Katara and Aang introduced later in the show. And to me, one of the things that came across very strongly in live action, I feel like it's a lot easier to know what ages people are. And there was a sense, I never liked that idea. We talked about this on our last episode, in part because Katara feels older than Aang to me. In this, it was incredible. Like, to me, looking at those two actors together, and maybe they're going to extend the timeline of the show some so that Aang really grows up, because in the original, it all happens over 6 months. But looking at those two, the idea of him having a crush on her felt very much like, 9-year-old Anakin having a crush on 14-year-old Padme. And it just made me it made me very uncomfortable, because it really feels like they are two different age groups at this point right now.
They are, and I've looked into this, right? In the animated show, Aang is supposed to be 12, and I believe Katara is either 14 or 15.
I thought she was 13.
Okay, maybe, but she is older than him, right?
Yeah,
right.
And I think part of the problem is how young they are, plus the 3 seasons take place in one calendar year, so that they don't age up that much. My understanding is that the live action show, to account for the fact that they have to film over multiple years and the actors are going to age up, the human beings are going to age up, they are going to let the characters also age up at the same pace.
Okay.
So by the end of the show, in theory, we should have a Aang character who is like 15 or maybe 16. And I think that will make it more palatable and more believable that they have this like young romantic relationship budding. Yeah. Right. But it was just like the fact that the original show all happened in 1 year, so he's at most 13. I think that is what really made that ending awkward. Yeah. The romance.
Because to me, it's not even just that it's an age, it's that, especially in this, she is a teenager, he is a child.
Yeah.
And that's what comes across to me.
I mean,
I know those lines are arbitrary, but like puberty is not arbitrary. Like, it's a thing people go through.
Sure. I don't know. I feel uncomfortable with the discomfort to some extent. But I mean, I hear where you're coming from. I mean, so here with the actors here, I think they're like 3 years apart, right? Although I think he's like 15 and she's like 18 or something.
It's something like that, yeah.
Which I guess they're both teenagers then. But like, I mean, he's a centurion also, I mean, he's like 100 something technically. Yeah, you're rolling your eyes, but like literally, I mean, because that's the thing though. It's like, I don't know. I think it's the sort of thing that, like, it's one of those things that is usually problematic, but to simply look at something and say this is usually problematic and therefore it's never okay, I think is problematic. And and I understand, like, in the first show, kind of sort of where people are coming from, but also I don't think she's supposed to be 15 or 16 in the first show. I think she's 13 and he's 12, and they're like a year apart.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, like, in a lot of ways, he's more mature than she is. You know, it's like they're mature in different ways. And I think it's complicated. And I don't know. I do think that their romance kind of comes like a little out of left field.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like it's not really, it does feel more like, you know, he kind of has a crush on her and she's like just focused on, she's obsessed with him as being the avatar.
Right.
You know, like that's like her focus in the world, in life, is like Aang is the avatar and is going to save the world.
Right.
You know, so that like eventually blossoming into some sort of something else is not illogical or unbelievable to me.
And to be clear, it's not that I think that it can never happen.
Yeah.
I do think that stages, like I said, you know, they're not always the same, but I think that there's a, you know, at first glance, this feels wrong to me.
Mm-hmm.
The show can make me believe it's okay by telling me that in the story. I don't think they did that in the animated. And I mean, in terms of how they feel for each other, sure, but in terms of like reconciling the age difference, I can sort of reconcile it by being like, well, maybe she's not as old as I might have thought she was. In this, it just looks much starker. Like,
sure, yeah. And I mean, I do think it's the sort of thing also that like, I mean, if you're that young, you're actually not that separated by that many years. Mm-hmm. And if it's not like it's not like they're having a one night stand or something. It's like they're, you know, kind of like life mates for like decades. And so after a few years, like, you know, I mean, just like I've never really dated anyone closer to me in age than they are to each other. I mean, granted, I've been an adult, you know, but like, and so has everyone else. But like, you know, I didn't really date in school. But like, my point just being that like over time, if we're talking about like a long-term relationship, like the age difference is like irrelevant in terms of them like being interested in each other and like getting it on. Like, yeah, no, that seems weird. That seems weird to me. He's 12. Right. But like, I don't see that as, that's not like, it's not that kind of show, you know, like I feel like it's not that kind of romance.
Right.
But I don't know.
Yeah. So we'll see. It just was striking to me, but let's talk about Katara herself. Cause again, I don't feel like she had enough to do that made her really stand out. And I think Katara's, the character of Katara gets some really great stuff later in the show, including in this season. But there was nothing about her that made me feel like, oh, this is the wrong person. Like, I thought the look was great. I love that they got her hair perfect. She felt very believable to me, and I really liked seeing her, and I want to see more of her.
Yeah, she felt kind of like Aang to me. You know? Yeah, I kind of felt like they were both fine. I enjoyed their scenes together. I liked them kind of teaching each other a little bit, you know? You know, she's learning water bending very fast, you know, but like, that's fine. Like, she's talented, right? I mean, it's a world where like bending is kind of this innate ability. It's like an innate talent, but then developing that talent is a skill. You know, and so she's kind of not really been trained. She's deliberately not been trained throughout her life. So she's been kind of stumbling through on her own. And then finally she gets to talk to a master bender who has some wisdom that helps her with her bending. And then she gets a scroll, and like, that's helpful too. You know, it's like, oh, now here's some concrete knowledge related to like water bending. I feel like she didn't have a lot of super cringy lines that she had to deliver. I'm trying to remember. There were Gran had to say most of the things that were just
Gran had to exposition dump.
Like, yeah, maybe that saved us from having to like have Katara deliver that lines and then have to like live with the character for the rest of the series, you know?
Well, so let me actually ask listeners, if any of you did not watch the animated show, what did you think of when Gran is in the sort of hall with all of them, and she says, you know, once the four nations lived in harmony, but then the Fire Nation attacked, and she gives this kind of like, it's a speech, and she says, this is a story we've all heard. That is almost word for word in a way that made it jarring that it wasn't exactly word for word. the exposition that came at the beginning of every single episode.
Yeah.
So it felt
voiced
really,
by Katara.
Yeah. I'm wondering if, to someone who hadn't heard that before, did that sound like a grandmother telling a story in a way that has been told down through the ages again and again? Or at least for these actors, or did it feel really awful? Because to me, it felt really awful.
Yeah.
But to all of us, I think. But I'm curious, to someone who hasn't seen the show, did it feel different?
Yeah, I'm curious too.
Yeah. It was too bad because other than that, I did love Gran as well. I thought she was very good.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's okay if you're just...
The casting beyond the main cast that we're going to follow, like, I'm really enjoying some of the people that they're peppering in here. So Gran was played by Casey Camp Horanek. And then Yukari, who is Suki's mother, the mayor of Kyoshi Island, is played by Tamlin Tomita, who you may recognize as, I believe it was Kumiko from Karate Kid 2 from way back in the 80s. And she came back for Cobra Kai, whatever the season was.
Yep, I remember that.
He went back to Japan. So, and she's been in a lot of things. Most recently, I think she was in Star Trek Picard. So seeing her in this was great for me. And Kyoshi Island, like her, Suki, like the Kyoshi Avatar character, all of that. Give me all of that, like more of that. We're not getting more of that. We're barely probably going to come back. But that, like we were talking earlier about spin-offs, that's the spin-off I want, is like the Kyoshi Warriors spin-off and like all of those characters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, or like just maybe like thread some of that goodness through the series, you know, let's see what's going on in the rest of the world. We don't like just have to follow the main characters, you know?
Yeah. I mean,
I don't know.
A lot of my absolute favorite characters get introduced in season 2 or 3, so.
Yeah.
At least, Paul, you don't want to know about any future any people that have been announced as being cast, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I'd rather only talk about the performances we see. The only ones I knew of were Paul Sun-Hyung Lee and Dallas Liu, who was in Shang-Chi, who originally I thought played the young Shang-Chi, but he didn't. He played Awkwafina's younger brother.
Oh,
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Who was like he was just like there to annoy her, I think, mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Katie's younger brother.
Another thing I thought was done very well that, again, I was very trepidatious about, I freaking loved Appa. And Momo was perfect.
Momo! Like,
so good!
Momo!
That's more of a character.
Yeah. That was one of the few spots where I feel like they got more out of Momo than the show did for most of the time than the original.
Momo's a walking whimsy machine. And they did him perfectly.
Yes. Looks great. He's hilarious. Like it's the relationship between Momo and Sokka already. I can see kind of Sokka makes his meat jokes or whatever, but then it's like you could tell, okay, they're gonna. This is where some of our whimsy and our humor and stuff is going to come from, and Appa as well for sure. Yeah, I it's too bad Iroh never gets on Appa because then we'd have Appa on top of Appa.
Exactly. Anyway. Yeah, I mean the scene where Aang hugs Appa, I teared up. Yeah. Like that was very powerful. Yeah. So it's kind of like don't put your hand right on his nose, dude. That's not comfortable. I've had babies do that to me and it sucks. But other than that, I loved it.
Yeah. No, the fact that relationship is clearly so important to the storytellers that they understand that Appa's Aang's only living friend from his old life so far. That's a big deal. That's a relationship that survived 100 years in an iceberg, And so, to me, that was one of the top things that I really was hoping that we'd get, and it's just a little, it's subtle so far. Hopefully we'll get, all the way through the various parts of the story that I love so much, but just even just getting that much is something that I feel like the first adaptation was just completely disinterested in, you know? So
that's it. So, All right, we've gone for a good long time. We're not going to do bonus content. Frankly, we're giving you 4 episodes in 4 days, and I think that's pretty awesome. But members, you are getting these episodes earlier. Because of the way that I post these episodes, I work with other folks who generally don't work on the weekend. It may be that the episodes are going to come out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. But I imagine a lot of people are not going to watch the whole show until over the weekend. So, but this episode will definitely go out on Friday, and then you'll get the others possibly Saturday, Sunday, Monday, or a couple days later. But any other last comments either you want to make?
I'm really looking forward to seeing more of Zuko. I just think the sort of anger and desperation that I've gotten from the character, along with the complete absence of malice.
Yeah.
You know, like there's this rage, but it's this rage that's not at the people that he didn't want to burn the village to the town, to the ground. He just was going to, you know, but like it sells the character for me in a way that I feel like it took the animated series a while to get to the point where I feel like they've given me a better Zuko here than the animated series did in the first 10 episodes. And so I'm hopeful that the whole arc will just be, I mean, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and speaking of Zuko, one thing I noticed that they seem to be maybe emphasizing more was Zuko's belief that the Avatar, I think he calls him the ultimate warrior.
Right, yeah.
Right? Because when Aang gets escapes from his ship, he says, he ran, the ultimate warrior.
Yeah.
And so, like, he has this image in his head of what the Avatar is supposed to be, and the fact that it's this kid first off is a surprise, but then the fact that he's running away. I hope that this is something that they keep revisiting, because ultimately it is a part of Zuko's journey, is that understanding that it's not about how you use your bending in terms of fighting and might, but about the heart.
Yeah. I think it's all really true. And I'll say, I still don't think overall it's a good thing, but I will say one positive of those first scenes was, in terms of what we're talking about here, that sense of malice you're talking about, Paul, that we didn't feel, I absolutely did feel from the Firebenders attacking first that Earth Nation guy, and then later the Air Nation, the Air Nomads temple.
Right.
And I feel like it made Zuko's really stand out, because those people they're fighting for the Fire Nation. They want to defeat the Fire Nation's enemies. They want to kill these other people. Zuko, to me, feels like he wants to do what will get his honor back in the eyes of his father.
Yeah.
And the father has said the Avatar needs to be captured. And so that's why he's captured. It's not that he thinks his father's wrong.
Right.
It's that he's just not questioning it.
Right.
He has no independent belief that the Avatar has to be captured, or that the Water Nation has to be destroyed. It's just like, this is the goal, and I will do anything that gets in the goal's way. But yeah, no malice, no sadism there.
Yeah. And to that point, I feel like the conversation between Iroh and Aang was actually, I feel like that was actually a really nice addition.
Yes,
you know, like Aang being like, why are you fighting this war? Why is this war going on? And Iroh kind of answering the question without saying what he thought, really. Yeah. You know, I thought it was a really nice way of framing it, and kind of helping to understand how the Fire Nation and its military can be the antagonist, but it doesn't mean that they're all evil. Like, what they're doing is evil, but it doesn't mean, it's like most of the people are just doing what they're doing. And like the fact that Zuko's just been brought up this way, and then Iroh's just lived in this world as, you know, the Fire Prince once upon a time. It gives some perspective that I feel we don't get until season 2 or 3 in the animated show. And that's not a fault of the animated show. I think it's interesting the way they do it, but I think it's nice to kind of have that early here, you know, and it gives me hope that we'll get deeper into that. Maybe that'll be something that for all the things that I've complained about so far, that maybe this series does have kind of something to say on top of what the original series had to say. You know?
Yeah, I hope so.
And that's the that's the flip side of what I said earlier about the Suki situation, right? Like Suki is destined to disappear now as a character, unfortunately. Yeah. But the fact that the writers of this show know about the entire backstory of Iroh means that they can better prepare the audience and pepper stuff like that scene in with Aang, which I agree was perfect. So yeah.
Yeah, it was awesome. Well, go ahead.
I just want to thank both of you because now I actually want to watch the next 2 episodes.
Yeah.
And before this, I mean, I was gonna, but like, I was like, I feel a little more optimistic, a little more, I can grab onto the parts that I enjoy and kind of let the parts I don't as much maybe pass.
I mean, I was right there. Like, that opening is so jarring as a fan of the animated show. And the brutality of what the Fire Lord Sozin does in that scene was just a shock. It was an absolute shock. And it seems deliberate. Like, that whole beginning seems very deliberate for setting the tone here and making sure that people understand that A, it's not the animated show, and B, it's not the previous live action movie. In both, in all the good and the bad ways.
Yeah.
I think that's really true. And I think that's probably exactly what it was. It was a sign of, if you're looking for a shot-for-shot remake of the original, this is not it. We are not doing that. And in some ways, it makes me almost wish this was a weekly show, because then you give it a little bit more time to settle. But also, I just want to know. I want to see everything else. Because frankly, mostly what's going to kill me is, like, if I do really get invested in this show, then waiting another year for the Earth Kingdom stuff. We'll see. But all right, well, thank you both so much. This was such a good conversation. And when Paul got started and I was like, oh, he's right, they're so right, I was worried this was just going to turn into 90 minutes of bashing it, and I'm really glad we didn't do that. And I thank you both for helping to make sure we didn't go in that direction. So thank you both so much. To our listeners, really want to know what you have to say. As always, you can find all the ways to contact us by looking in the show notes or just searching for The Ethical Panda on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram. You can become a member, get bonus content, ad-free content, and we're actually doing full bonus episodes right now only on the Star Wars podcast, but we're also doing that here eventually. You get all that, and it's only $5 a month. Great way to help support us and just be a part of what we're going on. If you like Avatar, if you like discussing Avatar, please share this with your friends. Tell your friends about it. Get them in the conversation. Follow us on social media, interact, do all the things. Such a great way to help keep the conversation going. So on behalf of myself, Riki, and Paul, thank you all so much. We have spoken.
Yep.
What was a demonstration?